Given its significance for millions of jobs in Europe, the Commission has been invited to present a vision for the EU's industrial future, including concrete measures. Third, the EU needs to further develop its digital economy, with a special focus on data and artificial intelligence. In this context, we supported a concerted approach on the security of 5G networks. Yesterday, the Commission put forward a recommendation in this area. Last but not least, trade. The European Council will continue to promote an ambitious and balanced free trade agenda that ensures a level playing field. The leaders called to resume the discussion on the public procurement instrument, as well as to pursue rapid implementation of all the elements of the US-EU joint statement of the 25th of July 2018. We also discussed our economic relations with China. Apart from next month's EU-China summit, there are also other meetings and summits with the Chinese leaders. Therefore, it was crucially important to agree a coordinated European approach. We worked out a positive stance that offers ambitious cooperation on bilateral and global issues, including trade. We both have a key economic interest in maintaining significant trade flows, which are possible thanks to the rules-based trading system. However, for this system to continue to operate, it needs to be quickly updated. For the EU, this means serious reform of the WTO that would cover industrial subsidies as a priority. We want to persuade China to address this, and I am convinced we shouldn't give up. As regards bilateral issues, we would like to finalise talks on the investment agreement already next year. We will discuss all of this with China at the upcoming summit. And of course, I can't imagine not having human rights on the agenda. I may be old-fashioned, but I still think that human rights are at least as important as trade. Additionally, leaders are determined to tackle climate change. Despite differences, it is clear how urgent the matter is, and the leaders will come back to this in June. In the meantime, we have instructed ministers to step up work on the EU's long-term climate strategy in order to implement the goals set down by the Paris Agreement. Turning to Brexit. As requested by Prime Minister May, the European Council decided to approve the so-called Strasbourg Agreement. Leaders also considered the UK's request for a short extension of the Article 50 period. Our decision on extension envisages two scenarios. First, if the withdrawal agreement is passed by the House of Commons this week, the European Council agreed to a technical extension until the 22nd of May. Second, if the withdrawal agreement is not approved by the House of Commons this week, the European Council agreed to an extension until the 12th of April, while expecting the United Kingdom to indicate a way forward. As I said after the European Council, the 12th of April is a key date in terms of the UK deciding whether to hold European Parliament elections. The 12th of April is the new cliff edge date. Before that day, the UK still has a choice of a deal, no deal, a long extension, or revoking Article 50. And here let me make one personal remark to the members of this Parliament. Before the European Council, I said that we should be open to a long extension if the UK wishes to rethink its Brexit strategy, which would of course mean the UK's participation in the European Parliament elections. And then there were voices saying that this would be harmful or inconvenient to some of you. Let me be clear, such thinking is unacceptable. You cannot betray the 6 million people who signed the petition to revoke Article 50, the 1 million people who marched for a people's vote, or the increasing majority of people who want to remain in the European Union. They may feel that they are not sufficiently represented by the UK Parliament, but they must feel that they are represented by you in this chamber, because they are Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. You have the floor.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, bonjour.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a week before us which is going to be rich in events, which I think probably advises not commenting on the events coming up. As the President of the European Council has just told us, there's a European Council coming up, which took place last week. And of course, all the conclusions have been elegantly presented by the President of the European Council. That means I don't need to repeat the exercise. We spent a lot of time discussing China. The debate on China was far less complicated than the debate on the United Kingdom. And I was saying to some of you that if I were to compare Great Britain to a sphinx, the sphinx would be an open book by comparison. And let's see how that book speaks over the next week or so. We devoted a lot of time to China. On the 12th of March, the Commission presented a strategy for China. The welcome to this document was pretty favorable. The heads of state and government didn't express opposition to the general lines of the Chinese strategy that we submitted to the European Council. Yesterday, at the invitation of President Macron and Mrs. Merkel, we agreed to meet with the Chinese president. And we want to be very clear. With China, we want everybody in China and Egypt to understand that we are partners, strategic partners indeed, that we're also competitors and rivals. In certain discussions, I noted that our Chinese friends don't like the word rival, but ultimately it's a compliment. We're rivals and competitors. That means that we need to ensure that Europe doesn't just hand things over, but rather that we're open. And that immediately means the right for European companies to compete in fair conditions in China, just as Chinese companies can freely compete in Europe and come to Europe. We respect China, and we would like China to respect us. So we need an approach to trade that is based on reciprocity, and full reciprocity indeed. For our part, we ask that we immediately reach agreement on an investment agreement. We want China to reach out to us on the protection of geographic indications, and we would like the working group that was established between the EU and China should pursue the reform of the World Trade Organization, and we don't want this to move so slowly. We want it to step things up and move with a degree of swiftness. On Brexit, I will say nothing. It's all been said.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de la Commission européenne.
Thank you, President of the European Commission. Thank you for staying with and speaking. And now give the floor to the President of the European People's Party, Manfred Weber.
Parlamentspräsident, Herr Kommissionspräsident, Herr
President of Parliament, President of Council, President of the Commission, colleagues.
For the good decision on Brexit, Mr. Tusk. I think the decision of the Council was a good decision. First of all, because the principle was included that there is no prolongation without clarification, though we need from our British friends more clarity about what they want to achieve. And we also created certainty for the 440 million Europeans on the question of the European elections, so legal certainty, also political certainty. I want to pick up your general remark that those who are fighting for a second referendum, those who are fighting for staying inside of the European Union, we are on their side. We want to have their success. We wish them all the best. But for the moment, we have still the situation that Great Britain wants to leave the European Union. That's the legal situation at the moment. And having this in mind, I think it's also important to explain to our citizens why a country who is leaving the European Union should have a major say in the future of the European Union. So that is also one of the questions on the table which we have to answer to our citizens. That's why I think what the Council decided to ask for clarity and no prolongation without clarification was a good step. And we wish now our friends in the House of Commons good luck. So hopefully they can manage it in a better way than the government did it in the last month. The options are on the table. The options are clearly described, and they have to choose now. And let's see. The second thing is about economy. And there I want to share with you that we as EPP fully support the principles about strengthening our economy, invest in single market, invest in trade, invest in innovation, no doubt about this. And the priority is the Chinese question, which is on the table in the ongoing discussions and the preparation of the summit. And I'm really grateful that we all share the same basic starting point, and that means that the cooperation with China must be based on principles, on values, on what we believe in. There is a competition going on the political systems, on the way how we think a society, how we organize a society, what are the basic values of a society. And that's why that must always be the start for our dialogue with China. The second thing we as EPP believe in is a pragmatic approach on climate change. China is still committed to the Paris Agreement, so they are on our side. On the free trade principle, China is a partner for us, that they are committed to free trade. So that's why we share a pragmatic approach towards the Chinese relationship. But the third point is also important, that we shouldn't be naive. And that means to protect our industry, to protect our key industry, to define and to protect our key industry in the European Union. And we also think, as EPP, that we have to rethink our competition law in today's European Union for establishing for the future a kind of European champions. To adapt the global dimension of competition in our legislation is also a key issue. Ich möchte, Präsidenten,
Mr. President, I have one final issue I'd like to address, and that's the question of fundamental rights in the European Union. President Tusk, for some months now, we've been discussing Article 7 with Poland and Hungary. That was encouraged by the Commission and the Parliament, but I think we haven't yet had an opportunity in Council to discuss this, and I really regret that fact. And many know that in my own party we've had very intense debates about this. Fidesz, the Hungarian government party, has now been suspended from the EPP in order to send out a signal that the path followed by Hungary is not the path that we want to follow. The Article 7 procedure here in Parliament was supported by a majority of EPP members, and I think it's important that this is discussed in Council now, that you put that on the agenda. Now, having different national governments attack each other publicly is one thing, but putting it on the table for discussion is another. So I'd like to call upon you to do that. We as parties, the Liberals, the Social Democrats, we are discussing this with our Romanian friends as well. In the EPP, we're discussing what the correct approach is. But it's important to decide on this approach and to take decisions. And I would hope that we can take further steps. We are seeing that Article 7 is not effective, that it does not lead to rapid results. So what I would like to see is us taking the next step to introduce a binding rule of law mechanism in the European Union, and as this House has previously proposed, many colleagues have been working on this, that we have a binding mechanism, that we ensure independence of assessment. Perhaps we could have annual reports on the matter, and we need to ensure that it's not only Central and Eastern European states, but that the entire European Union is assessed in terms of its respect of fundamental rights. So we essentially need an automatic procedure where these cases are put before the European Court of Justice. So I would propose setting up a mechanism that ensures that in future this process works, and also the requisite funding to ensure that this can be successful. And I think that when it comes to competition, fundamental rights are essential. We need to ensure that we follow this path into future. So, dear President Tusk, I would call upon you to finally put this on the agenda of the European Council so that you can talk about the cases we are experiencing in Europe there too. Thank you.
La parola all'onorevole Bullmann, Presidente del Gruppo Socialista.
Herr Präsident, werte Kollegen!
President, colleagues, we have 2 days. 2 days until the originally foreseen Brexit date. 2 days before that, end of March. What Mr. Tusk said is absolutely right, that the Council has dealt with this in a very careful and effective fashion in order to avoid any disaster. But 2 days before the originally set date for Brexit. Now, to the Brexiteers, I say the following. When are you going to pardon yourselves to the British people for this torture that they have suffered over the last 2 years? When are you finally going to admit the total disaster that you've led everybody to? Under lies and deception, everything that has been done. And you know that it has led the country into a total cul-de-sac, into a dead end, to economic decline, and you know the consequences, the terrible consequences that this has all. So get back control of your stability and your lives.
I apologize to the British people for what you did during the last 2 years. This is my main message today. Many thanks to President Tusk. Many thanks to what you did in defense of European citizenship. This was a very honorable move. And this is what has to be said here. Ja, wir sind Europäerinnen und Europäer.
Yes, we are Europeans. And nobody ought to trick the British people and deprive them of the ability to be able to participate in Europe.
If the government is not able to deliver, if the situation remains to be blocked, then there is only one chance: ask the people. Ask the people. Yes, I know why you shy away from that, because you are afraid of everything what happens in London streets, afraid to death because you can't stand it anymore. This will be the solution, and the British people will tell you where to go. They are the real sovereign and nobody else in this situation anymore. Lassen Sie mich sagen.
So allow me to say at this point that I believe that, of course, naturally, development in the UK has been overshadowed considerably, and we have the 9th of May, and a lot hangs on that. And the possibility for some sort of creation, a restart as far as the economy goes, economic development in Europe. And of course, we're speaking about a system which offers a fair opportunity to all. That is part of our agenda. And only when we're aware of this particular situation, when we're strong, in other words, will be able to deal with issues such as trade with China. Yes, indeed, a very, very strong partner that we simply cannot overlook and we cannot ignore. But without having that sense of self-confidence and awareness and of the success and trust in the European model, will we be able to have proper negotiations with trade partners of that particular nature and be able to move forward positively. The floor now goes to Mr. Ludko from the ECR.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, as always, there is good news and there is bad news. The good news is that the Council has managed to set out a clear timetable and that was accepted by the United Kingdom, and hopefully the solution will be found within the timetable. But let us leave Britain to the Brits. My concern is the European Union. The bad news is that the EU still seems to continue pursuing the same policy of deterrence, which, roughly speaking, consists of two elements. First, to punish the United Kingdom by a no deal, so that no one in the future would dare to follow their footsteps. And secondly, to humiliate the United Kingdom by inducing them to undo the Brexit by organising, for instance, another referendum. Well, and they're using the argument that it was a very small majority that decided about the Brexit. Well, if that had been the other way around, if the Remainers have won by the same small majority, their verdict would be considered here in this chamber as absolutely irrevocable and binding for eternity. Not to mention the fact that organising referenda until one gets the results one wants is a peculiar contribution of the European Union to the theory and practice of democracy. So this is a foul play. But the bad news is also this tone of self-congratulation which we have heard today. But this is not time for self-congratulation. This is time for self-appraisal. President Juncker, President Tusk, let us admit it, this has been the most crisis-ridden period in the entire history of European integration. And Brexit is one of several crises. And all of you who have taken the major decisions in the European Union are responsible for it. Do not delude yourselves. A great share of responsibility is with you, gentlemen, and ladies too. President Macron recently wrote a letter to everybody in Europe, and he proposed more of the same, that is, more centralisation. And the funny part of it is that he called it European Renaissance. Apparently, he does not understand the meaning of the words he's using. Probably the European twilight would have been a term more adequate. So, well, of course, the Brexit clock is ticking, and we are all aware of it. We await progress in London, and hopefully this will happen. But we also should be prepared for any outcome, and we should be ready to offer any help that we can. This is our problem too, whatever the outcome, and we should be friendly to the decision of the British people, whichever they go. But the clock is also ticking for the European Union, ladies and gentlemen, and you should be listening to voters across Europe. Voters, there are more and more voters desperate for change, and change will happen.
Thank you very much. The floor now goes to Mr. Verhofstadt.
Legutko, that there is absolutely wrong what he is saying, that there is a sense of humiliation or punishment from the side of the European Union towards Britain. We have far too much respect for a great nation as Britain to do that. You know what the problem is? The problem of humiliation and punishment is because of the mess in the Tory party. There is the humiliation of the British people. Sitting in your group, they are not even there. They are not even there. The only who is there is Mr. Farage. It's a surprise for me because I thought that he was marching somewhere in Britain. And he is here. A 200 miles march. How many miles you have done? 2 miles, you think? Something like that? Yeah, think so. You remind me more and more, I don't know if you know him, Field Marshal Hay in Blackadder. You know Field Marshal Hay in Blackadder? He was also sitting in the First World War in his office in London, and you are sitting here in Strasbourg, where your own people are marching to the rain and in the cold. That is the way you are taking your responsibility. Okay, but I want to recall the words of Winston Churchill, who said, if I may quote him, "Success is the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm." I think that is a quote of Winston Churchill was absolutely applicable today to British politics, the House of Commons and the Prime Minister May. Because this afternoon, dear colleagues, in the House of Commons, if the Speaker allows it, because that's their system, there will no less than 16 options on the table for a Brexit. So there is certainly no loss of enthusiasm, as in the quote of Winston Churchill. But more seriously, after all the negative votings of the last weeks in the House of Commons, Mr. Tusk, against the deal, against the no deal, against the second referendum and so on, I think there is maybe light at the end of the tunnel now, because with the approval of the Letwin amendment, there will be, for the first time, after 2 years of negotiation, maybe a solution based on a cross-party cooperation between Labour and the Conservatives, because I believe that such an existential issue as the Brexit can only be decided on a cross-party agreement in a parliament, as we do here in this European Parliament. And I hope that the way forward, giving them time until the 11th of April, will see a majority in the House of Commons for one of these options between Remainers, reasonable Brexiteers, because it's between them that they have to find a way forward. In any way, in my personal opinion, I'm not counting on the hard Brexiteers, because for the hard Brexiteers, it's not the interest of the country which is important, but the power struggle inside the Conservative Party, as we have seen the last days. And I repeat in that respect, and I think that I can say that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, in the name of the whole European Parliament, that we are open to have this agreement with Britain, that we are open to change the political declaration in 2 senses. First of all, in the way that we can make it more binding for both parties than only a declaration. And secondly, that we can put inside this political declaration a far more intense relationship between the EU and the UK than the relationship that is foreseen in the political declaration at this moment. And I think this deep relationship will also, to respond to your last intervention, Mr. Tusk, will be in any way also the seed for the future. Because I'm pretty sure that not now, I'm not so optimistic as you, I'm an optimist, but not so optimistic as you. I'm personally of the opinion that not now, but within a few generations, there will be the return of Britain inside the family of European nations. That's the place of Britain, to be inside the European Union, not outside the European Union. But that will not be succeeded now. That will be succeeded later on, and the seed is, let's be honest, the march of 1 million people in London, the petition of 6 million people a few days ago. And then finally, my last point on the rights of the citizens. I think, Mr. Barnier and Mr. Juncker, I know there has been a unilateral commitment by Britain to respect these citizens as described in the withdrawal agreement. There is from you also to Mr. Barclay a unilateral commitment to do exactly the same for the UK citizens living on the continent. Well, I think it's time now to look into the possibilities together with Mr. Barclay and you and both houses to see how we can formalise that the fastest as possible, so that in any case what's happened, even when the most stupid thing happens, for example of a no deal, at least these citizens are not the victims of all these games that we have seen the last 2 years. Thank you.
Per il gruppo dei Verdi, la parola.
For the Greens, the floor goes to colleague Smith.
President, thank you. Good morning, colleagues. What a sad place we're in on Brexit. What a tragedy. So many issues we should be working on together, utterly distracted by a self-inflicted disaster. Entirely because the UK still, even now at this last hour, hasn't made a decision on what it actually wants. Mrs May triggered Article 50 without a plan, and they still cannot find consensus. We see MPs today at Westminster finally trying to reach a settled view. Good. Welcome to the party. In the Scottish Parliament, we're debating revoking Article 50. Because from a Scottish perspective, and every single party in Scotland, except the Conservatives, are united around the view that the best Brexit is no Brexit. So colleagues, please, don't close the doors on us now. There are a lot of us in Scotland and elsewhere across the UK working hard to turn this round, to serve our citizens, to remain within this family of nations. But in what might be my last speech in this place after 15 years serving our European people, we don't know what's in the UK's future. We don't know what's in any of our future, and the forces of populism are gathering in all of our nations. We don't know what's in the UK's future, but I do know Scotland is a European nation. We celebrate international solidarity. We celebrate freedom of movement. If the European Union didn't exist, we would need to invent something like it, and Scotland would want to be part of it. Now you, as professionals, must deal with the United Kingdom as you find it. You must respect the UK's constitution, and I respect that. You must deal with the interlocutors you're dealt. Sorry about that, but you must deal with them. But when Scotland, if we are removed from our family of nations against our will, against our clearly democratically expressed view, if we are removed against our will, independence will be our only route back. Chers collègues, I'm not asking you to solve our domestic discussions. I am asking you to leave a light on so that we can find our way home. Thank you.
Per il gruppo confederale della sinistra.
For the GUI NGL group, the floor goes to Madam Zimmer.
Meine Herren
Presidents, well, we always seem to be holding the same discussions. We're not getting clear answers as to what's going to happen and how we're going to get out of this crisis. There are a number of reasons for it, but we have no clear answers from you as to what's happening. Now, we have to act in a way that shows full respect for those that voted for Brexit in a referendum. And we need to act in full respect of those who demonstrated in London at the weekend. And we act in full respect of those who signed an online petition. And we must act in full respect of people in the UK, in Ireland, in EU, are going to be hugely affected by the impact of Brexit. We must act in full respect of the European elections are coming up. And of course, we would like voters can send representatives to the European Parliament, but it only makes sense for MEPs to stand here, sit here for a reasonable period of time. Just being in the European Parliament for a few months doesn't make a lot of sense. There are people who want answers once again. And Mr. Tusk, I turn to you. And Mr. Juncker, please focus more on the rights of people who are going to become third country citizens immediately after Brexit. We've got to protect their lives, their families, their security, their way of life. And let me say, we must show respect, particularly for people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And if no solution can be found between leaving the customs union, leaving the internal market, then all of the Good Friday Agreement is in threat. We want to avoid a border within the island. We must make clear that if they were to call for it, there could be a referendum on the unification of the island, and in that case we would be supporting them. Thank you.
Per il gruppo della Libertà e della Democrazia Diretta, la parola.
For the EFDD group, Mr. Farage.
Belgian Prime Minister, you would know that it was Field Marshal Haig in 1914 who saved the Belgian town of Ypres from German domination, who then went on in 1918 to lead Britain in its greatest ever military feat, defeating Imperial Germany on the Western Front. Far from mocking Haig, as a Belgian, he should be a great hero to you. But never mind, maybe that sums up your anti-Britishness. Sticking with Belgium, I thought what happened at the summit last week was a national humiliation, an impasse, because we have in Mrs May a Prime Minister who hasn't got the courage, who hasn't got the vision to carry out her many repeated promises, namely to take us out of the European Union this Friday, March the 29th. It is not happening, and we're witnessing a slow motion betrayal, perhaps the greatest betrayal of any democratic vote in the history of our nation. And the reason, of course, is this withdrawal treaty. And I'll go back to the First World War. We won the war, but we had the Treaty of Versailles, and this treaty is the modern day equivalent. We have a reparations bill of £39 billion we have to pay for nothing in return. We have the annexation of a part of our national territory in the shape of Northern Ireland. This treaty is a bad piece. It is unacceptable, it is not Brexit, and it will not pass. Now, I know that you're all getting terribly excited about what the House of Commons may do over the course of the next week, and we know what they'll do. They'll come back with some form of agreement around a customs union and the continued free movement of people. But even if they do that, the one thing that's inevitable is that we're headed for an Article 50 extension. And I think you should ask yourselves, do you really want that? Do you really want Brexit to utterly dominate the next couple of years of your business to the exclusion of your many other ambitions? Do you really want the United Kingdom to contest the European elections, to send back a very large number of Leave MEPs just at a time when you're fighting populism as you see it across the continent? Do you really want me back in this place? Yes. Well, there we are. And all for what? Because Brexit is going to happen anyway. Mr Tusk, if you think the British people have changed their minds on Brexit, you, sir, are deluded. Because actually what we now see are opinion poll leads of 15 and in some cases nearly 20% in favour of leaving. If we had another referendum, Leave would win it by a bigger margin. So why put yourselves through years of agony? I pay great tribute to Mr Juncker, to Mr Barnier, to the European Commission. You have prepared your no-deal scenario. It is highly professional. It shows that actually leaving with no deal is not going to cause huge disruption. It even suggests that with no deal, there's no need for a visible border in Ireland. So I would say to you, to all of you and national leaders, reject the British extension beyond the 12th of April. Get Britain out, and then we can all just get on with the rest of our lives.
Per il gruppo Europa delle Nazioni della Libertà,
For the ENF group, Mr. Batten, please.
In the long and eventful history of England and the British Isles have we been brought to such a national and international humiliation. Never before have the British been governed by such a pack of traitors, quislings and collaborators. Theresa May has snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in a way unparalleled in the history of the world. Her so-called deal is an unconditional surrender treaty, except that we have not been defeated by a foreign power. Instead, those entrusted with safeguarding our freedoms and liberties have surrendered them to a foreign power, the European Union. But the final surrender is not yet complete. Mrs May still has some grovelling left to do. If Britain does not leave the European Union on the 29th of March, then it will mark the official end of democracy in the United Kingdom. Except that no people that want to be free can be enslaved forever. No EU withdrawal agreement, no EU future relationship agreement, no treaty can bind a people that do not want to be bound. In Britain, any act of Parliament may be repealed and set aside. No Parliament may bind a future Parliament. The English Constitution will prove to be stronger and more durable than any EU treaty or agreement. We can still leave on the 29th of March by the grace of God. But if we do not, then the UK Independence Party will lead the struggle to set Britain free from the European Union in the years to come. And if necessary, we will start that in the next European elections in May.
The non-attached member, Madam Dodds.
This Friday, March the 29th, should have been an historic day of significance for the United Kingdom. A day when, after 40 years of membership of the European institutions, the United Kingdom would again be an independent nation. A nation working side by side with Europe, but free from the federalist agenda of Brussels, free to grow our own economy and control our own laws and destiny. After 2 years of negotiation, our Prime Minister has concluded a draft withdrawal agreement that has twice suffered historic defeats in the House of Commons. A draft withdrawal agreement that would see Northern Ireland leaving on different terms to the rest of the United Kingdom under the backstop. An agreement from which the Attorney-General advises that there is no legal right of withdrawal. The DUP wants to leave the European Union in an orderly fashion, but this deal will endanger the constitutional and economic integrity of the United Kingdom. It is not a price that we as unionists are willing to pay. Finally, some advice to Mr Tusk and Mr Bullman. 17.4 million British voters signalled their desire to leave the European Union. I think this House owes them some respect and should acknowledge their democratic choice instead of focusing on everyone else. To Mr Verhofstadt, the British Parliament has already voted for a unilateral agreement around citizens' rights. It's time we caught up in these institutions. And to Mrs Zimmerman, the Belfast Agreement has a principle of consent. It is only with the consent of the people of Northern Ireland that there will be any moves towards a change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. You would do well to remember that.
The floor now to from the EPP, Mr Lewandowski.
Panie prezydencie, moich rodaków w kraju.
President, the people of my country would be surprised by what Mr Legutko said today. This sympathy for the situation of Brexit, whereby his party, that is currently in government in Poland, would be happy to see a Brexit. At the moment, they're trying to get the EU out of Poland too, but that won't work. The lessons from Brexit should be learned in Poland too and in other countries in Europe. To date, the only positive fruit of Brexit has been the mass demonstrations for Europe in Britain and the silence of those who, in 2016, were treated as the proponents of Brexit. Above all, the story of Brexit is a tale of what the consequences of irresponsible actions can be. When an existential decision is put to society, but the burden of this decision is not shouldered. Thank you.
Altieri.
Thank you, President. We are now only 2 days from the date when Brexit was supposed to happen, and we still do not know when, how, and even if Brexit will happen. This says a lot about the way the UK government conducted the process. However, it also says a lot about the lies and fantasies the Brexiteers sold before the referendum. These have now come crashing down against the reality and trade-offs that leaving the EU was always going to entail. These realities are all too clear to the million UK citizens who took to the streets of London this weekend demanding a people's vote and a better future for their country. What is also clear is the solution to this deadlock is in London, not here in Strasbourg nor in Brussels. Monday's vote in the House of Commons gave a glimmer of hope for a way out of this incredible deadlock. The UK Parliament decided to step in and take back control of the Brexit process. We now need to see what they do with this control. We have always said that the political declaration can be reviewed to pave the way for a closer relationship between the EU and the UK. We can do this quickly, and this is not only possible, but is something we would welcome. On the contrary, if the House of Commons does not provide a clear cross-party majority for a custom union or the single market, nor adopts the current deal, then serious choices must be made. If the UK decides to ask for a long extension, of course, this cannot be to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, which is closed and will not be reopened. But if the UK asks for a longer extension to rethink Brexit, to work for a closer relationship, or to provide for election or a referendum, then of course we will support it. President Tusk, our group has always been clear on this, because we have the sense of historical proportions. Guy, you said you want them back, but not now. We have always respected the referendum, but if the UK does not leave, we shall celebrate, and we will never do anything to prevent this possibility to happen now.
Mr Nicholson, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I said at the beginning of this that it will go down to the wire and beyond. I have not been disappointed. I also said at the very beginning that the people that I represent would never accept a border in the Irish Sea, and that still stands, Mr Barnier, and I hope you're listening to that. And I also have to say to those, the backstop and what unravel the fabric of the Belfast Agreement, an international agreement which many in this place champion, but willfully forget the principle of consent within that agreement. And I have to say, there's a need to listen to everyone in Northern Ireland, not those who just shout the loudest. There's a very quiet majority of people in Northern Ireland who also want a good way forward for Northern Ireland, for the United Kingdom, and indeed for the European Union. I think we've got to move away from positions of the past and find a better future to which we can all work within. I am still concerned, Madam President, that we are still in danger of crashing out. Nobody's fault, not Mr Tusk's fault, not Mr Barnier's fault, not anybody's fault. But there's a danger of it crashing out, and I hope Mr Tusk will ensure that that does not happen. And I listened to him with interest, and I say to him he needs a firm hand. And can I indulge once more, Madam President, with you, for this could well be like my colleague from Scotland, my last speech after 30 years in this Parliament. And can I say, it's been quite a long time. I've enjoyed it, and all the people I have worked with through that time, I sincerely hope that I've represented the people that I represent in Northern Ireland with distinction. Thank you.
Mr Nicholson, how thoughtless of me not to respect you as one of the senior members of this House. And can I say on my own behalf, and I hope on behalf of most in the Chamber, I will miss you if you go. But if is the word I underline. Let us move on. Madam Scott Cato, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, President. At the weekend, the Prime Minister again attempted to stitch up a vote for her Brexit deal. At her Grace and Favour Chequers home, she negotiated with a dozen white men who represent a minority of her own party. We can guess what she said to them. The massive London March for a People's Vote and the record-breaking petition to revoke Article 50 show that the mood of the country has swung strongly against Brexit. Vote for her deal now, or Brexit might be lost. They might also have to fight European elections, a terrifying prospect for the Tories, as just like a second referendum, it would provide a democratic opportunity for people to express their views and show their rejection of the Brexit project. The Tories are running scared of the will of the people. But we will not be silenced. Across our country, the resistance to Brexit is growing. We look to Parliament to send the decision back to us, confident in the knowledge that we have the strongest pro-European movement in our continent and that the country will vote convincingly to stay in the EU.
One and a half minutes, Mrs Anderson, and if this is your last speech, I will indulge you for an extra 30 seconds. Thank you.
Irish Republicans take no pleasure in stating, "We told you so." Before the referendum was even called, we were in London telling the British government the damage that Brexit would do to our island. We were right. We campaigned for the North to remain in the EU, not out of the total love of this place or some of its policies, but because we knew the damage that Brexit would inflict on our island. We were right. And more importantly, the majority of the people of the north of Ireland agreed with us. At the start of the negotiation process, we warned all involved of British negotiation tactics. And I have to say, I'll let you all judge how right we were. Their ignorance and their arrogance, fuelled by the Democratic Unionist Party, has brought us to the abyss on which we currently stand. Brexit has been described as a never-ending series of question marks, yet one question provides us with a very simple answer for Ireland and possibly for the EU from this utter mess and total shambles. The Good Friday Agreement, endorsed by many in here, contains the solution. President Tusk, so build on the Council statement of April 2019, have the necessary conversations, answer the big question, de-dramatise the issue once and for all. If we remove the border, we remove the problem. So plan for Irish unity based on the principle of consent. Go raibh míle maith agah go léir. Thank you all.
Mr Paksas, for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. European leaders are getting further and further away from the spirit of a union of nations. They increasingly speak in favor of globalization, a ideology of sorts, and indeed the whole EU's political system is unable to resist this ideology. This is protecting at all costs the interests of big companies. This to the detriment of the borders of nations. This globalization has a negative impact on the environment. It impoverishes nations, and it also undermines the rule of law. Citizens are no longer living in their own homes. Their nations are being privatized by political elites, and citizens are marginalized. Tens of millions of Europeans are under threat of poverty. Millions of children are growing up in children's that live in difficult situations. We must oppose such policy. We must be anti-globality, and we've got to get on with it.
For 1 minute, please.
Emmanuel Macron a beau jeu.
It's all very well for Emmanuel Macron to denounce in a press conference the naivety of Europeans in trade matters. This brief moment of lucidity did not prevent him from signing the conclusions of the last European summit, a text which advocates quite the opposite. It is said that the EU must safeguard its interests in the light of unfair practices of third countries, even calling for making full use of trade defence instruments. That's all very well. But this very same document calls explicitly for the conclusion of new free trade agreements, whereas the European Council states its attachment to a free or open trade system and its determination to resist all forms of protectionism, even European ones. And I'm sure that will have the Americans and the Chinese in stitches as they continue to buy up our companies by the cartload. We need to put an end to this great fool's bargain which places the nations of Europe between the American hammer and the Chinese anvil. We have ended up in these old dogmas of free movement, free circulation, free trade. Europe is not a protected space. It is a playing field for the United States and the Chinese, who are perfectly prepared to protect their own interests and their own economies.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Hookham.
Thank you. While some compared Mrs May's dash to the European Council last week with Chamberlain's Munich mission, I think it's more like rage in our era than peace in our times. However, the real depth of public anger at the political establishment's Brexit betrayal continues to go unnoticed. And as the EU elite continues to try and ride roughshod over the will of the European people, the stirrings of serious unrest are becoming manifest in equal measure. The fact is, the people of Europe have had enough of lies being used as the building blocks for an EU superstate, while the governments of Europe are deaf to their concerns. If you were complacent enough to think Britain's vote to leave the European Union was just a protest vote cast by the fickle British, then you were kidding yourselves. Brexit was the starting gun for a new European political era. And as Paris burns, the Dutch people scream for change at the polls, and this Parliament braces for a Eurosceptic invasion. The superstate dream is shattered.
Madam Grossetête, 1 minute.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I won't speak to Brexit. It's been discussed at great length. Brexit is taking EU hostages, preventing it from building its future from the outset. This is a British political crisis, but it affects our citizens and our business, and people are increasingly fed up of the tergiversations of the British. We've got to settle this issue. Fortunately, the Council also looked on the growth and the industrial future of Europe, particular emphasis being placed on artificial intelligence. We've got to catch up in the digital field to retain the place of Europeans in tomorrow's economy. For China has taken the lead. That means there is a urgent need for the EU to get on with things. I welcome the crucial role as an engine that France plays. Council has adopted a firmer tone, but we know there are still divisions, and I take note of what President Juncker said. Europe should be open, but shouldn't just hand things over. Now, Parliament has made proposals that were ambitious for 2050 on climate change. Europe is on a slippery slope here. The member states don't want to wake up to the urgency of the matter. When will they wake up?
2 minutes, Madam Rodrigues.
Dear Presidents of the European Council, European Commission, this European Council, the Spring European Council, was the last one before European elections. And yes, we expect a lot from the European Council. 20 years ago, we were able to define a grand plan to deal with Europe and globalization. This was the Lisbon Agenda, followed by the Lisbon Treaty. I believe that the time has come to define again the grand plan for Europe and the world. And yes, the world is changing a lot. When it comes to China, it's very important to say what we just said, that yes, we want to have a strategic partnership with China, but working in the two ways and respecting our values. We also know that fighting against climate change and promoting sustainable development goals will become an absolute priority for the next agenda. And most of all, if we speak about European sovereignty, we know that we Europeans, we need to master the current digital revolution. Yes, we need to promote the European way to drive the digital revolution. And this should be said to our Chinese partners in the next upcoming summit. A European way of digital revolution means protecting privacy, our security, our freedom. This also means to use digital tools not to undermine democracy, but to enrich democracy. This means that digital innovation should be at the heart of promoting new services and new products to meet human needs, citizens' needs. And most of all, we need to make sure this will be translated into more and better jobs, and we can update our social protection systems to protect citizens all over this big transformation. I'm pretty confident that for Europeans, knowledge, culture, our creativity is by far the main asset. And this should inspire the kind of artificial intelligence we must be developed. So we need to invent this new phase of the future. There is a lot of life beyond this deathly path of Brexit.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Pizzotto.
Now, a Europe of Juncker, of Merkel, of migration. The situation has led to something totally unacceptable. The Commissioner has pointed out some of the errors made by Italy. We are ready to change this particular Europe because we don't want to be enslaved to banks and to power structures. We want to build a new Europe, a diverse Europe, a Europe that defends its borders against illegal migration and has proper systems of control and surveillance and protects its workers as well. On these years, we've combined disasters, one disaster after the other, which have had terrible consequences for Italians and for Europeans. Italians with great pride, in a couple of weeks, will send you all home. We will be the first party in Europe because the vote of the people of Italy will be a true indication of democracy and liberty.
Mr. Ujazdowski, for 1 minute.
Szanowni Państwo.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we should put an end to this Brexit debate. There's far too much emotion. We're using this debate to talk about domestic debates. Ms. Harris talked about the demoralisation of Great Britain, and that's absolute nonsense. We should talk about the agenda of the European Council. Let's get back to that. Here we can read about geopolitical issues, sanctions against Russia, and that's the condition for a European solidarity. If we talk about solidarity in its truest sense, then the security of Central and Eastern Europe is very important, because that is what the whole of Europe's security depends on. As regards economic issues and the competitiveness of Europe, we need consistent measures to be taken. The Council conclusions state that the single market is very important, and any barriers to companies should be removed. However, there are still barriers in place that impede freedom of entrepreneurship. We should be consistent in our approach to this matter, and these barriers need to be lifted. Thank you.
Mr. González-Pons, for 1 minute.
My colleague Esther de Lange took a snapshot. We're just getting Brexit, and all the pro-Brexiters aren't here. They come to Europe to cash in, but not to do any work. The European, or rather the British Parliament, should act like adults and take a decision, because millions of people depend on them. It's time to put an end to political games. It's time to decide in or out. There's no other decision. And if it's not possible for the UK to stay, and if they don't think they're going to be able to stay for the foreseeable future, we shouldn't hold European elections. It's just to keep on negotiations. And well, look, we haven't had Canadian members of Parliament here when we negotiated with Canada. Likewise with Japan, we haven't had Japanese here, so we can't have British members of Parliament just to negotiate with the UK, unless French, Dutch, German, and so forth representatives in the British Parliament. You can't sit on both sides of the table. We're talking about the future, not the present, and the future of tomorrow's generations too. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Synodinos.
The decisions for the free and just elections, just a euphemism, does not serve democracy, but quite the contrary, a lack of transparency and domination of party politics. Non-existent enemies are cooked up so that the European elite can come out smelling like a rose and not admit to its errors. What we need is a return to real structures, and this through patriotic movements. Furthermore, the European Union, although it condemns misinformation, at the same time it promotes political ideologies. Just like paid agents of the Turkish MIT Secret Service, misinformation is spread here within this particular parliament. And the same thing, just as the Albanians' supposed Cham Albanian people, collaborators, they have served the twisted ideology of a greater Albania, and they are active here in this parliament as well. Just as political scum and traitors who have handed the name of Macedonia on a silver platter to the Slavo-Albanians of Skopje, they are in here as well. The enemy is in our midst. The ramparts have been breached. Europe has been an active participant in all of this.
Madam President, Mr. President of the European Council, Mr. President of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen, nobody wants to punish the British people. Nobody wants to humiliate them. We would like to have them in the European Union. They were always very good partners. But now to use these arguments, we want to punish and humiliate them, it shows that the Brexiteers in this House have lost any other argument and want to get support by this argumentation with punishment. I think we are ready to come to proper deals on the basis of the withdrawal agreement. We can do something on a political declaration. Aber ich glaube, dass es wichtig ist.
But I think that it is important for the House of Commons to come to a decision. London needs to make its decisions. It needs to come to an agreement. That is the path of the British people, the way they can be given a better future. And I think that this is essential. It is essential for this to be finally decided. The European Council has given them room for manoeuvre, but Perhaps a longer extension could be granted if this is not possible, always on the basis of the withdrawal agreement that's been negotiated. But if a parliament is unable to take a decision, then the parliament should pass that decision to the people through general election or through a referendum. That is the normal path to be followed. Thank you.
1 minute, Mrs. Sippel.
Thank you. On the 19th of March, it led to Mariuno. The Mariuno was impounded, and people who have saved people at sea are threatened with up to 20 years in prison. Not a word from Council about this, and not a word from the UN or the Women's Refugees Commission on daily torture and rape in so-called official camps in Libya. But we cannot and will not remain silent if member states ride roughshod over our values, including our Christian values. They shy away from responsibility. They look away when people die. Mr. Tusk is even looking at me. And they punish those who try to help. But please help those who are rescuing at sea. Please decide on the reform of Dublin, for which there was a majority here, because not saving people shouldn't be punished. It's not helping people that should be punished. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hübner. 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, for 122 days, the withdrawal deal has been on the table. And here again, today, we are in a crucial week of important votes in the House of Commons, awaiting this time around that the outcomes of the vote will be determinant and citizens will see a way forward. The limits of uncertainty, both economic and political, were pushed to the limit during Brexit, and not by the European Union. The European institutions, member states, we have spared no efforts to provide as much certainty as possible to this process. The Strasbourg Agreement, approved last Thursday by the European Council, provided one more layer of legal certainty, not only to the withdrawal agreement, but to the whole process. So let me finish by saying that if the option for a longer extension is seriously discussed, if there is in the UK a cross-party debate and decision on a renewed political declaration, we urge you, the British political parties, to do it in a way respecting citizens, their rights, and avoiding creation of uncertainties for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Leinen, 1 minute.
The European Summit quite rightly dealt with the issue of Brexit. And we can see from this debate how much time and energy this issue is taking away from other important issues on the agenda, such as climate protection and how we deal with the global power of China. But it all belongs together. China is a partner in our climate protection, but China is also a competitor for climate protection technologies. China has a clear strategy for expanding its use of new technologies. They are a leader in the field of car batteries. And so I wonder, where is the European Union? Do we have a strategy on climate technologies? Do we have an industrial policy in this area? For storage technology, the manufacturing of our own car batteries, new technologies for the commodities industry, for the production of steel, cement, also on a chemical basis. We don't have such a strategy, and we need to draw one up. When we have our summit with China, they will be our partner, but at the same time, they are a systemic rival. And I think that in any new approach to China, we need to protect ourselves without being protectionist. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 1 minute.
My summary of Brexit is as follows. Brexit, oh Brexit, is driving us mad. Everything about it is awfully bad. Backwards and forwards, it boringly grinds, as May tries valiantly for a meeting of minds. And hopefully that meeting of minds can be achieved this week in the House of Commons. And above all, in doing so, they may take cognizance of the 1 million people who marched in London last weekend. There's a big difference between marching and signing a petition, and that should be noted. And above all, we hope that the House of Commons can take a decisive decision to avoid a crash out at all costs. We don't want a no-deal scenario.
If that could be avoided, then we could live with anything else, be it a withdrawal agreement, an extension or whatever. But if they do not come to that decision, the confusion will remain and everybody will continue to be worried. And then it will be, in the words of Oliver Goldsmith, and still they gazed and still the wonder grew, how the swashbuckling Brexiteers just hadn't a clue. Mr
Farage finds that amusing, which is charming. Thank you, Sean. Mr Dance, 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. I can't follow that sonnet, I'm afraid, but what I find utterly astonishing today is not a single member of the governing party in the UK is down to speak, because they're terrified of what their government is doing, because it is now, of course, in hock to the kind of people that have now vacated the chamber, save for one Mr Farage, who have promised the earth consistently, who have said that Brexit means one thing, and then it's turned out to be quite another, a bit like the March, actually, promising people one thing, charging them the earth for it, and then disappearing, presumably in a private jet, to come here to Strasbourg to lecture us on what should be happening. You will never, ever take responsibility, Mr Farage, for the mess that you have landed your country in. You are responsible for the national humiliation we see today, no one else. And it's high time that you and every other Brexiteer took responsibility for the lies and the misleading campaign that you have consistently led in our country to bring it to its knees. What I say to you, Mr Tusk, thank you for your message of solidarity. It is very well heard and very well received. There is a mass pro-European movement in Britain, and we are not going anywhere. We want to defeat these people. We are on the right side of history, and we are proud to have you with us. May I say one small point of order, Madam Vice Chair? Earlier today, Mr Batten called people traitors and quislings. That kind of language is completely unacceptable in this chamber, or in any chamber for that matter, and he should apologise.
And the House supports you. Mr Rangel, 1 minute, please.
President Tusk, Mr Barnier, head of the EU negotiating team. The first point I want to make clear for the whole of the British Parliament, and no point saying to Mr Farage, he knows that already. All of the European Union is acting in good faith. We have good faith towards British negotiators and the British people. The second point I want to make clear is that the Brexit question isn't just a question of negotiating and rights, and it's not about what rights would go to Brits living in the EU or Europeans living in British. It's also about helping people on the ground, helping people and businesses, and that's not happening at the moment because uncertainty is only increasing with these postponements. There's huge uncertainty amongst business people. I've talked to business people in Portuguese business in the UK and Brits living in Portugal, and I have to say that independent of the discussions we may have here about treaties and what have you, at the moment there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are suffering from instability and uncertainty, and that's stifling the lives of people and businesses. Thank you.
Mr Silva Pereira, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The Council took the right decision on the postponement of Brexit. A short extension of Article 50 will only be acceptable up to the 22nd of May, and if the divorce agreement with the UK is adopted by the Council of Commons this week. If that doesn't happen, the United Kingdom has at most until the 12th of April to once and for all clarify what it intends to do. And there's good reason for this. The European Union cannot accept that the Brexit and the mess of Brexit should contaminate European elections and create a legal or a legitimacy battle within the newly elected European Parliament. So as rapporteur for the recomposition of Parliament, I include a clause stating that the new composition of Parliament will only enter into force if Brexit becomes or comes legally into force. So we should avail of that. If there is no agreement, if there's no deal, though I hope there will be no deal, Mr. Tusk made right. If no deal is prevented, what we need is a longer extension which allow British people to vote the European elections, and it'll give time for the UK to determine a new strategy for its future. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker on my list, but by no means least, is Mr. Ashworth, and I will afford you extra time because I hope this is not your last speech. But if it is, you have extra time.
Well, I look forward to having extra time next time, then, President. Thank you. President Tusk, on behalf of 1 million people on the streets in London, on behalf of 6 million people who have signed the petition, and on behalf of 63% of the British population who did not vote for Brexit, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to this House for the support you're showing. And I want to reassure you that Nigel Farage does not speak on behalf of that 63% of the population. May I add as a comment to the European people that for over 25 years now, no British Prime Minister ever explained to the British people what Europe did, what are the benefits, and why it matters. They never defended against the untruths which were spoken, and they never took ownership of the decisions that they took in Council. And because of that, the British press ran a 20-year campaign based on populist mistruths, lies, and deceit. And the consequence of that we see today. In Britain is a sad nation, divided like never before, and a House of Commons in crisis. So let Brexit stand as a cautionary tale to the people of Europe. To the people of Europe, I say this: you are the generation who have lived through the longest period of peace and the greatest level of prosperity ever. Never take it for granted. Value it. Fight for it. Defend it every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashworth. My decision was the right one, to allow you to speak. And I think we are all heeding your warning, because I think you said it with deep emotion and affection for your country. Thank you. Catch the eye, I will not be lenient. 1 minute and 1 minute only. Madam Šojdrová will set the example. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say that taking the floor after Mr. Ashworth is not an easy task at all. I respect your words so much, and every single British person should hear what Mr. Farage said today, what Mr. Legutko said. You were talking about deterrence, as if the British Parliament did not vote already twice on a dignified agreement, allowing for dignified Brexit. Isn't it the Brits who decide about themselves? We're not deciding about you. The British are deciding about themselves. And I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Tusk. Thank you for speaking about the preparation work for EU-China summit. Human rights, you spoke about human rights. They need to indeed take part of any trade agreements. This is extremely important, and European Parliament raised a number of urgent reports here and spoke about human rights. It's very important. And EU member states have to be the same. I can't really understand what Mr. Macron meant.
Mr. Lopez Aguilar, 1 minute, please. I am trying to take everyone who has looked for Catch the Eye. Please, thank you.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. President Tusk, many of us in the European Parliament have often been critical of Council. Not this time around. You've done the right thing by setting a clear date. No more extensions beyond the 12th of April, so the British plan can find an exit plan. Not out of the European Union, but out of the labyrinth in which they're lost. We've expressed our sympathy for the millions of Brits who've marched to stay in the EU. But we've never been demanding enough with the demagogues who caused so much damage to the British people by deceiving and manipulating. And we must clearly state that now is that time. No more extension. The bad news is that you've barely allowed us to talk about anything else. The good news is that the clock is ticking. A message to the House of Commons. Settle the matter. Decide, will you? Leave or revocation. And without that, there have to be elections. The Speaker is cut off.
Please, for 1 minute.
Madam Chair, Brexit has turned out to be a very chaotic process. 3 years ago, the British people have opted to leave, but it is still unsure when and how it will take place, which is shameful, not only for the British government, which is unable to own citizens, but also for the EU. Even before Brexit, the establishment ignored the will of the Europeans on the referendum. So this has all been seen and the lessons have not been learned. Brexit is being used to send out a message to other member states not to even think about leaving. Because if this was a problem for Britain, what would happen to smaller countries which are not islands on the margin of the EU and which do not have a common currency? Negotiations were not led in goodwill, and when things will have to be paid, then the other side will be blamed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've had a very good debate about the Council and Brexit.
To Mr. Farage, I really wanted to tell it to you already a long time. Stop telling lies. Even today, you continue to tell lies. And then I also want to tell it to Mr. Ashworth. I think you gave the right message. I think we have to fight for Europe. I think we have to renew Europe. I think that's the lesson we all have to take here in the European Parliament. And that's what I really want that all of us do, campaigning for elections in May, fight for Europe, protect Europe, and know what Europe does for us. Thank you very much.
Madam Verkunen, 1 minute.
Madam President, Brexit is a huge tragedy and it shows where populism can take you. This is a Gordian knot in the United Kingdom which is affecting everything the European Union is doing, and I think I hope that Parliament will be able to assist in finding a solution out of this, because it's an extremely difficult situation. Now, Brexit has shown in concrete examples what the EU is all about. Too often people assume that or freely accept that we can travel and live anywhere in Europe, and companies know that they can export and import any way they want. But that's all based on our shared legislation and treaties. So it's quite clear to all European citizens what is possible within the European Union. I think we have to support a process whereby the UK can find a lasting solution. And I believe that a new referendum would be the most realistic way forward for this.
1 minute.
Grazie. Thank you very much, President. I won't speak about Brexit, but about the climate. Thousands of young people are protesting throughout the world with regard to climate change, against that. And I think the moment has come for the European Parliament to recognize this particular effort. There has to be a global effort to deal with climate change. And at this point, it seems that young people are on the forefront. we have to establish a clear line with regard to what is going to happen, what the policies are going to be, what will be adopted by the European Union with regard to this. And I think, indeed, we have to look at the issue of competitiveness, industrial competitiveness as well. But we ought not use this as a kind of mask. We have to understand where the seriousness lies in this issue and put aside numerous different issues in order to create the necessary conditions for a proper future for our young people. Now, according to a number of different scientific studies, the situation is almost at the point of being irreversible. So the time has come to really look at this particular problem with great seriousness.
Madam Chair, Madam President, I don't think that anyone in this room thought that the British would ever make a decision. We couldn't believe it, and we didn't want to believe that they gave in to populism. And what we've heard from Mr. Farage in this chamber this morning, this verbal poison, the British economy is every day bearing the cost of this decision. And I think that the lessons of Brexit will be learned by all those in Europe dreaming of leaving the EU, and those people who want to inject ever more poison into the EU. And I hope that we'll not see more populists in this room after the elections, those who want to leave the EU. For those people, the EU is the enemy.
Thank you, Madam President. At the beginning of this session, President Tusk highlighted an initial text in the conclusions of the Council, namely, a strong economic base is of key importance for Europe's prosperity and competitiveness. And he pointed out, Mr. President, that the Commission is invited to present by the end of 2019 a long-term vision for the EU's industrial future, with concrete measures to implement it. Now, Mr. President, I appeal to you, and through you to, again, President Tusk, who for the moment has left, but I see he's coming back, and to Vice President Katainen. Think carefully what this wording means. By the end of 2019, the Commission shall be presenting a long-term vision. This cannot be a technocratic exercise, Mr. President. This should take into consideration the deindustrialization of Central and Eastern Europe over the past decades. If we want to have a balanced industrial future, it has to take into consideration this central challenge for industry, jobs and growth. At the beginning of this meeting, Mr. President, you had to tackle the issue of mobility. Now, this is an example of services from Eastern Europe being driven out of the market by using legitimate social and labour concerns. This is something which should be avoided at all costs, and I do invite you to personally pursue and oversee how this industrial future paper will be transmitted from one parliament to the other, from one commission to the other, because this is key to the future of Europe. Thank you, President, for giving me these several seconds more.
Onorevole Starbatti.
Colleague Starbatti.
Ich habe mir die Debatte hier angehört.
President, I listened to the debate. I think that this House is full of Pharisees, and of course our leading Pharisees. It's this House and the Council that has driven the UK out. For Greece, all red lines were overstepped, even though the euro is in. And Cameron wasn't even allowed to discuss the issue of free movement, and if Cameron had got some kind of responsibilities, then Brexit would have happened completely different. Freedom movement was the reason why British people voted in favour of Brexit. Let's not forget this pharisaical pointing of fingers. Do listen, Mr. Bullman. Likewise, Ms. Verhofstadt. I mean, these people, they really are, you know, up in orbit. They have no idea. There's the Ireland conflict. We don't want the UK as a second-class citizen. We've got to help the UK to leave. The UK is never going to accept second-class membership, not be able to vote, to pay in money, to accept the ECJ, not be able to negotiate its own trade deals. That's why it is right and proper for there to be a referendum. And this House and the Council should say, we want to reach out to you. We want to discuss it. Madam President, you gave everybody else 2 minutes. Yes, just a minute. This is my last sentence. We must say to the Brits that they have a right to resolve their issues the way they want, and they'll come back. Thank you.
Mr. Epitideos, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. The way in which the issue of Brexit has been managed by the European Union is indicative of the fallacious policy that has been adopted for all serious issues which the EU deals with. Rather than contemplate and try to correct errors that have been made and try to find some sort of way out and facilitate Brexit, what has been done is naming and shaming the UK, and with the same spirit Poland, Hungary as well have been punished and sanctioned. Fidesz, the party of Mr. Orban, in the same fashion. We've had this type of approach, and we've had this punitive approach towards Greece and the Greek people with the implementation of the various memoranda in an attempt to reduce debt, supposedly. So, a punitive approach, sanctioning, punishing, this seems to be the philosophy of the European Union. 2 years later, in this European Parliament, in this chamber, the goddess of revenge, Nemesis, will make her appearance. Thank you very much. Madam Spiraki. Thank you very much, President. As you know from your mother as well, the ancient Greeks said that every cloud has a silver lining. So let's look at it in this particular fashion, Brexit. What we can see here are the results of populism, the lies and deception of Mr. Farage and all those who believe along the same line that he does. What does Brexit show us? It shows us the danger, the way that people respond in this particular populist fashion. What we have to do, however, is give the British people all possibilities to make the choice that they want. We don't want to cause self-harm. We don't want any sort of erratic behavior on our part. I think what we have to do is we have to show that we are the European Parliament. We ought to offer the UK the ability to behave with clarity, to move forward with clarity, and we ought to support, ladies and gentlemen, a second referendum with that. Thank you. Madam Grappini, please.
Grappini.
Madam Grappini.
Onorevole Jurek.
Colleague Jurek.
Pan przewodniczący Weber mówił tutaj, że
Mr. Weber spoke about Article 7. He said that this article has not brought about the desired results, and that it has not resulted in the necessary discipline being meted out, and that we should in some way try and circumvent this article. And this is the kind of thing being stated by the future potential president of the European Commission. But perhaps we should look at the stance of member states and recognise their position. We have to realise that the EU treaty does not want to enable any simple separation within Europe. Now, if Mr. Weber doesn't think that the rule of law is important, if he doesn't think that the opinions of the member states are important, if he doesn't want to take into account the opinion of the few, then perhaps the unity of Europe is something he can get on board with. There are so many divides, we shouldn't make them even deeper.
The floor now goes to the chief negotiator, Mr. Barnier.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, in this very important debate, I, President Juncker, and Mr. Katainen have all listened very carefully to what you have to say, and I would like to say a few words, and I'd like to thank you, of course, Mr. President. At the invitation of President Donald Tusk, who I'd like to thank personally, I once again took part in the debate at the European Council that we're talking about this morning. And I can bear testimony once again on this very extraordinary negotiations on Brexit. Once again, we saw the responsibility that is incumbent upon every European leader around that table. They are, objectively speaking, responsible for the decisions they make and the way they work in these discussions. Around 2 years ago now, President Juncker and President Tusk endowed this task upon me, that is, to lead these negotiations, of course, with the support of the European Parliament. For 2 years now, ladies and gentlemen, I, like you, and this was the main point the Parliament wanted to focus on, I have always thought that the question of ensuring the rights of citizens had to be a priority for us. As Guy Verhofstadt and Manfred Weber, Mr. Gualtieri, Mr. Bullmann and Gabi Zimmer mentioned, as well as others. And this priority of citizens' rights, we've got 4.5 million citizens living and working in the European Union who, Mr. Farage, contribute to the economy of your country. 1.5 British citizens live and work in one of the other countries of the European Union, and ensuring the rights of these citizens, as President Tusk has said, will, under any circumstances, under any agreement, or under the circumstances that we would not like to see, but for which we are preparing a no deal, Mr. Verhofstadt, this will remain a priority, and we will find a way to guarantee the rights of these citizens. For 2 years, we and I have been working with the same level of respect for the United Kingdom. I admire your country, ladies and gentlemen, and I say that very often. I admire it for its history, for its culture, a certain number of great men and women who have led it in history, without forgetting, of course, the solidarity that you showed in our gravest hours in the 21st century, the solidarity you showed with us. And it is in this atmosphere of respect that we are working. And Mr. Farage, when I say respect, I mean the respect of the sovereign decision of the British citizens, the majority of British citizens. And we respect that decision, although we regret it. And we are doing everything we can, patiently, rigorously, conscientiously, methodically. For 2 years, that's what we've been doing. Mr. Farage, no one in Brussels is trying to steal Brexit from you. No one is trying to undo the vote put to the British people. But it is not Brussels that decided that the UK would leave the European Union. You were the ones who made that choice, and you are the ones who have to take your responsibility and to face up to the consequences of that decision, no one else. So, for 2 years, in this atmosphere of respect, we have been taking a number of decisions. And I'd like to say to Mr. Legutko, who is not here to listen, unfortunately, that at no point over the past 2 years has my attitude, has our attitude shown the least will to try and retaliate against the United Kingdom, to try and humiliate them. For 2 years now, to President McGuinness, who presided earlier, to Mr Nicholson, I am always very interested to hear what you have to say, Mr Nicholson, Mr Anderson, Ms Dodd. For 2 years, we have been patiently looking for specific and operational solutions to the most serious problems created by Brexit. And of course, these can be found in Ireland. The risks to the peace and stability of this island, to which we have been contributing over the past 20 years through the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, we're trying to preserve that. That's what we're doing, nothing else.
The no deal. In all scenarios, the Good Friday Agreement will continue to apply. The United Kingdom will remain a co-guarantor of that agreement and is expected to uphold it in spirit and in letter. The Commission is ready to make additional resources available to Ireland, technical and financial, to address any additional challenges. Donc le respect du Good Friday Agreement restera la ligne.
So the respect of the Good Friday Agreement will remain the line to follow. There will be no hard border. Because, of course, we have to respect the single market as well, our single market. But it's also out of respect of the British internal market, Mr Farage. There are going to have to be checks carried out somewhere. And that's what we're talking about here. For 2 years now, we've been working on these negotiations, and they have always been rather negative. There is no added value to Brexit. No one, not even Mr Farage, would be able to demonstrate the added value of Brexit. No one. It's a negative negotiation. It's a lose-lose situation. And as such, we must intelligently find a solution that limits the damage caused by this decision, and to do that as soon as possible. And because, Ms Rodriguez, you said something very important, there is so much to do outside of Brexit on the very positive agenda that President Tusk and President Katainen will talk about later. That's what counts. And in that positive agenda, there is, of course, place, other than the divorce that we want to be as early as possible, there is a very important place in this positive agenda for constructing what is even more important with the United Kingdom, and that is a strong and long-lasting relationship with a great country which, under any circumstances, will remain a friend, an ally and a partner. The decision taken by the European Council, by way of conclusion now, was a very important decision in order to face up to the situation, the unforeseeable circumstances in the Chamber of Commons. And the decision was to show the will of the Europeans for the United Kingdom to take its own decisions and to shoulder its own responsibilities. It is up to Britain to decide, one way or another. That is what was decided by the European Council with this set of 2 deadlines, either May or April. It was to open the possibility to the United Kingdom to shoulder its responsibility. It is now over to this country to decide how to shoulder that responsibility and to choose what it wants for its future, and ultimately to bear the consequences of the decisions that it has taken. And because, ladies and gentlemen, these negotiations are not trade negotiations. It's not bargaining that's going on here. We're not having 2 sides make concessions. We've never worked in that spirit. It is an exit process. The United Kingdom is leaving the EU. It wants to leave the EU. That means it wants to leave the customs union, the single market, and it will bear the consequences of that. But of course, as President Tusk said, it can still stay. Anything is possible up until the 11th of April. But this choice has consequences. And the United Kingdom must bear those consequences. It must take responsibility, and it must remain sovereign in all of this. And this is the possibility that is opened up by the decision made by the European Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barnier. The next speaker is the Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Katainen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, honourable members. Even though the debate has concentrated almost purely on the Brexit issue, I will not comment more on that because our chief negotiator, Monsieur Barnier, already explained everything relevant so elegantly. But I would like to comment on a couple of other points which were also part of the European Council agenda, namely industrial policy and especially the EU-China relationship. Very shortly on industrial policy, the Commission has already set up a working group. It's kind of an expert group which has been working on the future of industrial policy of Europe. The target is 2030, and this group has already been working more than a year. I'm co-chairing it together with Commissioner Bieńkowska, and we will come out with the proposals, concrete proposals, by summer. So this paper is in the disposal of the next Commission and the next Parliament. The aim is to identify the most crucial points how to modernise the European industry. But then another very important topic, EU-China relationship. We appreciate a lot that Council paid attention to our proposals and endorsed many of our proposals because EU and China are strategic partners. And strategic partners usually do things together, not only speak together on the issues. And this is actually a little bit problematic situation currently. We share many views with Chinese authorities on various policy issues, and we have also done something together. But there are many issues which we have mostly been talking about, but not doing that much. And this happens mostly in the fields of economy. China is superpower, political superpower, foreign policy superpower, military superpower. It's also a technological leader. It's a business leader in many areas, and that's why there is no point to see that China is only a developing country. China, for sure, is a developing country with many respects, but taking into account the power in the world's economy today, we have all the reasons to expect reciprocity. So this is what the EU is expecting from the Chinese side. Strategic partnership based on reciprocity, especially when we talk about market access policies. The European Council also asked the Commission to come with a concrete proposal on how to improve our business and economic relationship with China, and this is under our work at the moment. We are preparing, for instance, state aid rules to third country acquisitions. As everybody knows, we have very strict state aid rules when it comes to intra-EU acquisitions, but the same rules don't apply with a third country, and this is problematic. We want to make sure that there is a level playing field. There is hard competition, but not unfair competition. So we have to make sure that our single market is open for everybody, but it's fair for everybody. We cannot allow unfair competition to happen or take place in Europe. We also, like President Tusk said earlier, we expect to finalise our investment agreement negotiations with China by 2020. This is of utmost importance. It will help Chinese and European investments to flourish. Also, we expect China to accept geographical indication agreement, which has already been negotiated but unfortunately not approved yet. So, honourable members, as I said, we are strategic partners. We work very closely in many political areas, but especially the economic cooperation is one of the particular areas where improvement is needed in order to maintain a level playing field and in order to allow European companies to do the same things in China what Chinese companies are doing in Europe.
I agree. In conclusion, the President of the European Council, Mr. Donald Tusk, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just two remarks. The first one, for clarification, dear Maria, this was not the last European Council before the elections to the European Parliament. It is pretty likely that we will meet still in April to discuss Brexit. And for sure, we'll meet on the 9th of May in Sibiu, also to discuss our long-term EU strategy. It will be in an informal meeting, but anyway, also dedicated to absolutely crucial topics. And to Mr. Farage. Mr. Farage, you have presented passionate arguments against the second referendum. But the truth is that the second referendum took place in 2016, because the first one took place in 1975. And then a vast majority of the British public decided that the place of the UK was in the European community. It was you who thought 3 years ago that it was possible to organize a referendum in order to invalidate the previous one. Then please be consistent also today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The debate is closed.
Mes chers collègues, nous allons poursuivre.
Colleagues, we will continue our debate. We now move on to a joint debate on the mobility package. First of all, Mrs. Kuliner's report on enforcement requirements and specific rules for posting drivers in the road of transport. Mr. Vinderkamp's daily and weekly drafts of minimum breaks and rest periods and positions by means of tachographs, and the report by Mr. Erstug adapting to the development in the road transport sector. First, I will give the floor to Mrs. Kuliner.
Arvoisa puhemies.
Madam President, colleagues. This has become something of a saga, and we need a lot of strength and robustness to keep up with this, which started 2 years ago. What we're about is fair rules in transport, decent and proper social conditions. They need to be looked after properly in the market. This has become challenging, but we put together compromises. Some believe that too many compromises have been made. Others, on the other hand, feel that the legislation doesn't go far enough, that we need tougher rules. Now, compromises rarely mean that people leave the room and go away feeling winners. When I was a child, I would go. I would have expected different rules, but what we've sought to do is get a fair set of rules in the transport sectors that will allow drivers and companies to flourish in Europe. It's been interesting to follow the debate where it's been claimed that we put together compromises so that many can't vote in favour of it. Now we have, I think, for many, a lot of this it's very difficult to swallow. It's very difficult to accept that we've got games of the rule in Europe that will allow drivers to work in decent conditions. We know that there are these postbox companies that bypass the rules on road transport. Now, at the outset, we believed that we'd put an end to nomadic drivers. Drivers have a right to go and see their families on a regular basis or to go where they please. We managed to put together a compromise on this. Nomadic driving will cease, and drivers would have the right to return to their home or to an agreed place, agreed with their employer. The idea was also to get everybody paid the same way for the same work. Because in the transport sector, we need to apply the principle of equal pay for equal work. Now, this hasn't been enough for some. Some want to follow the posting of workers directive example, where everybody would be a posted worker as of day one. Now, there are those who could advocate this on the basis of their views of social protection, but I think it would undermine the flexibility. And we need to address the question of not having trucks driving around Europe a day empty or half empty. Postbox companies, clear rules, putting an end to illegal cabotage, and putting an end to other illegal practices are issues we seek to address. And the idea is to create a clear set of obligations, and of course we have a clear set of rules on enforcement on this. That's things like the electronic tachographs and other measures. I think the electronic tachographs in particular will be helpful in this regard. Now, compromises have been achieved, but many have worked hard to prevent a vote on the compromises, and I thought we would show the backbone to get this voted and to show that we really believe that drivers have a right to fair rules, and also we create a set of rules which allow companies to compete on a level playing field. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. van der Kamp for 4 minutes. Madam Chair, thank you very much. Following on from what Ms. Kyllönen has said, I can confirm that Mobility Package 1 is an integrated package containing posting, driving and rest times and cabotage. And we've all noticed over the last days and weeks that it is a very tricky subject, politically speaking, because it really touches upon the heart of the single market of the European Union. In my file on driving and rest times, it's a question of improving the working conditions of drivers. And it's not so much about the daily working and rest times. That's dealt with in a different file, so we're not looking at that in particular. What it's about is rest times at night and during the weekends. And the most essential question is about where exactly that driver spends their rest time. As we've seen, on many European roads, trucks are illegally parked. There are no cooking facilities, no sanitary facilities, and that's what we're trying to solve with this file and the proposal from the European Commission. And in that respect, we are to a certain degree impeded and supported by the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. They have stated that weekend rest may no longer be taken in the cab, so we're trying to find a solution for that by prohibiting it, but with a generous transition period. Another aspect of this file is when the driver returns home. We don't want to see nomadic drivers who are away from home for more than 4 weeks at a time. They should be able to go home on time, and their employer should be able to guarantee that within 4 weeks as a maximum. And then there's the short weekend rest that can be taken in properly equipped parking spots. Another part of this file concerns bus drivers, and as you know, Madam Chair, passengers are not containers. So for bus drivers, we've introduced a little bit more flexibility. Not 16 hours work, as some members of the S&D are claiming, but just a little bit more flexibility.